Now I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Give me 1 second here while I set up the screen. Can everybody see the screen? The Nabor contract? I see people shaking their heads, sticking their thumbs up. That's good.
Yes.
Let me get the chat
Yes.
going. Where's the chat now? Okay. All right. So the way we're going to do this is if you have a question, shout it out or put it in the chat. I am going to address them as best I can as we go through the process. I seem to be having an issue with the chat though, so let me figure that out. Where is the chat? Okay, there it is. Perfect. Okay, if you have a question, throw it into the chat and I will answer it. You can unmute yourself and you can shout them out and we'll go over that way as well. As we go through this today, as you can see on the screen, I'm going to be giving you some information about the Nabor contract, but it's not technically legal advice. So that's, I'm a lawyer, so I'm start with a disclaimer. That's the way it goes. A little bit about who I am and who our firm is. I've been founded the office in 2007. We focus on real estate and business law. We help all types of real estate entrepreneurs, buyers, sellers, realtors, property managers, and we have a full service litigation department in our firm, so we can help with those issues as well, deposit disputes and things like that. And of course, we have offices throughout Southwest Florida. A little bit about me. I have been licensed since 2003, which makes me old. And I focus my practice on real estate and business transactions. I serve on the Legal Resources Committee of Nabor, and I help write the contract that we're going to go over today. As a matter of fact, I was the scribe at the last rewrite. So all the spelling errors, I guess, are now my fault. Just kidding. I'm from Nebraska, and I tell corn jokes occasionally, and I'm a recovering politician. So again, I apologize for those jokes too. Today, we are going to go through the Nabor contract. I'll point out a few differences in the FAR contract, and we're going to review some of the addenda and amendments as we go through, and I'll point them out. Just as a point of reference, I am going to be referring to line numbers occasionally, not often, but occasionally, and they are to the Nabor 2021X. So I'm going to show you this. I should have done a screen share or something, but if you can see, 2021X is the form that I'm going to be referring to, which is this form that's the most current form in your form simplicity, zip folders, and all those things. This is the most current version of the Nabor contract. So before I get started, does anybody have any quick questions? Okay. So let's dive right. Oh, also, I will make the slides available to anyone who wants them afterwards. I'll give you my email address, shoot me an email, and I will send you the slides. Okay, so we're going to dive right into page 1 of the contract, and we're going to talk about the buyer and the seller. Now, I teach a whole class on buyer taking a better listing and how to get the correct seller on your contract. This is a very, very important thing. You don't want to have the wrong parties on the contract, then come to closing, find out that you're not going to have a closing because the wrong people are bound. So let's be very careful about making sure that we know who the seller is, whether it's an LLC, a trust, someone signing with a power of attorney, someone has passed away and there's an estate, then the PR would sign in that case. The buyer side, of course, is much easier because you ask them who they want the title to go into, and that's who's on the contract. Typically for the buyer, you want them to match their driver's license. That's a general rule of thumb. If they're going to form an LLC or take title in a trust, they can do that from the outset on the buyer side, or we can correct that as I talk about later. This contract is freely assignable by the buyer. Okay, so the next part of the contract is, what are you selling? The property, of course, and you want to make sure that you adequately address the property, the legal description, the address in the contract. And we have some questions. Hold on. What happens when buyer is Brian Smith and assigns? What document do you need, if any, if the contract is assigned? Great question, Kristen. Nabor provides an assignment form. So you would have the buyer and the assignor and the assignee would sign that form. It would be acknowledged by the seller, but the seller doesn't need to sign it and doesn't have to approve it. So look in your forms for the assignment of contract form. Okay, so it is in Florida, you basically need three items to make a contract for real estate. First, it has to be in writing. Then you have to have the parties, the property, and the price. The court will infer a reasonable closing date and reasonable terms if you don't already have them in your contract. So making sure that you have the correct property, the address, the legal description, and any appurtenances, that would be garages, cabanas, storage lockers, parking spaces, boat slips, boat docks. Making sure that all of those are correctly listed on your contract is very important. Notice also in the contract that there's a long list of items that you are actually conveying. If you just go to page 1 of the contract, if you've got it handy, things like the home automation, audiovisual home entertainment, and home sound system, including all operational components and software. So that big stack of black boxes in the corner of the $10 million mansion by the television that controls everything in the house, all that stays. Even though it's not screwed or glued, it stays. Things like the washer and the dryer. This is a big difference in FAR-BAR. I see a lot of FAR-BAR contracts, they have to write in washer and dryer, or I've also seen the case where the realtor has had to buy the buyer a washer and dryer because they said it conveyed when it actually did not. So let's be very careful how we list any additional items. In the contract, there's lines that talk about included and excluded property. Be very careful. Don't just write C attached inventory and then not attach an inventory. If you don't have an inventory for personal property, the Nabor provides the addendum to contract to provide an inventory, where the seller provides an inventory, the buyer approves it, and then we go and we put it attached to the bill of sale. Jeffrey is asking, is a prior version of the contract a valid contract? Yes, you can use a 2010 or 2001 version. You can go back to the 3-page version of the Nabor contract, but you wouldn't have the most current law and the most current standards and practices in use in the industry. And so we generally recommend that you use the 2021X version, which is the most current version. Although if you've got an older version, it is still perfectly valid. Going back to what I was talking about, exclusions, make sure you list exclusions, be specific. If it's all the art on the walls that is going, and make sure that it says all of, don't just say all of the art, try to be specific. You can get into some trouble there. We've had issues where people thought they were getting things that they weren't, and we have to refer back to the contract. And so making sure that that is accurate is a big deal. Moving to the next section of the contract, the purchase price. Very easy, should not be a big deal, but sometimes things get messed up, especially if you do them by hand. Make sure that on line 28 there, you see on the screen, line 28, that's your purchase price. And then everything else below subtracts from the purchase price until you get to the balance of the purchase price that's going to be payable by the buyer at closing on line 38. I've seen it where people go in and out of counter offers and they forget to make all the changes to say the amount due at closing, the balance of purchase price, and then there's a question at the end what the buyer actually has to bring to closing, and the buyer doesn't understand sometimes they agreed to a higher price. That means the amount they bring to closing is going up as well. Valentina is asking, can the personal items go on the bill of sale separate from the contract? No, Valentina. This is a big source of confusion for realtors. The bill of sale is the document that transfers title, much like the deed, for the personal property. So you wouldn't sign a bill of sale at the beginning of the process. You would sign at the end of the process, where the when you're ready to do your transfer, your closing. Okay, so making sure that everything balances here is very, very important. You don't want to have confusion. Typically, we do 3 days on line 30, 29, and 31 for the initial deposit. And let me talk to you for a second about deposits. I like to see deposits, in the 5 to 10% range. That does two things. That lets the buyer know that you're serious, and to put some skin in the game for the buyer, so that they're not just making multiple offers all over the place, which you'll see on the as is sometimes, and that's a different story. But if they got $1,000 deposit on a $500,000 property, that's not enough to make sure the buyer performs. The seller's only remedy in this contract is deposits made, which is another difference from FAR/BAR, which says deposits due. So if you put $1,000 down and then the buyer walks because they don't like the inspections, they're losing $1,000. If you put $10,000 down in this contract, maybe they're going to go through the inspection process and let the seller review everything. So it's a big deal, I think, to make sure that you have enough money in escrow to start the process. Any questions about that before I move on to offer and counteroffer? Okay. So on your contract, you have the offer and counteroffer language. It is malpractice to leave line 42 of the contract blank, in my opinion. The making an open offer in this market where a seller could just jump back in and say, I'll take your offer and cite it, could be a big problem. So I would always fill in line 42 with an offer. I typically would put 8 p.m. on the date the last date that you want the contract to be acceptable or accepted. And I put 8 p.m. because everybody puts 5 p.m. and then 5 p.m. rolls around and we're still scrambling to figure out what we're going to do. And I work till 6:30 anyways, so 7:30, sometimes much later. So typically like an 8 p.m. on the last day that you want the offer to be out there is what I would put down. The contract automatically says 2 days for a counteroffer unless otherwise stated on line 43. And then remember, in this contract, the effective date is the last date signed or initialed by either party. Big difference from the FAR/BAR, which requires delivery. So if you've got that 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock offer that's been accepted and you don't deliver it until the next day, then the next day is the effective date and you basically have given one more day for inspections. And note, under the FAR/BAR, you still have to have, or the Nabor, you still have to have delivery of the contract. Let's see here. Moving right along, closing date and time being of the essence. A closing occurs on the date stated. So we have line 48 says that you put the closing date down. That's the day that we're closing. That's the day the lender targets. That's the day the title company targets. And when you put on or before, you still have to have an agreement as to what that date is going to be for the move up. So I see a lot of on or before, and it looks good on the offer, but at the end of the day, the buyer and the seller still have to agree on a date. Now, this is a major, yes, question?
I'm sorry, so you don't recommend putting on or before?
And you can put it on there. You can put it on there for effect, so that the seller knows when you're making your offer that you're going to be ready to close sooner, especially on a cash deal. But you still, the title company and is still going to need to know the closing date, and you're going to have to agree on that closing date between the buyer and
Yeah.
the seller.
True.
So you
Okay.
use it I'm not saying don't use it. I'm not saying don't use the phrase to make your offer look stronger, but just
Mhm.
know that you still are going to have to agree on the actual date.
Correct. Okay.
Okay. So the next major difference with FAR/BAR, time is for essence of the essence for closings only in this contract, and that's a big deal. The time being of the essence for closings only means that if, for example, the deposit is a day late in the Nabor contract, then the seller's remedy is not to terminate. The seller's remedy is to send a breach letter and give the buyer a reasonable time to correct their breach. Reasonable in this case, I would argue, is 1 business day. Now, I have to warn everybody, I went through this with the seller, and there is a case, the Natchitoches case in Florida, that says that deposits are essential, and missing a deposit, in this case was over 60 days, is a material breach of the contract. So be very careful about making sure your deposits are in on time, and understand that time is of the essence in the FAR/BAR means that it's guaranteed if you miss a date in the FAR/BAR that the contract terminates and the deposit goes at risk. But if in the Nabor contract, there's an opportunity to cure. Now, another difference here in the Nabor contract, the buyer selects the closing agent in all counties. We list out Charlotte and Lee County and say that when it comes to who pays for title, Collier being different than the other two, but the buyer selects the closing agent. So for those of you in Lee County who have a buyer and you want the buyer to control the title agent, then you would use the Nabor contract, even though the seller pays for the title. And then, of course, the condition of the property at closing is to be in a broom clean condition and free of debris. So that means that the property has to be swept, but not professionally cleaned. Questions
Can
about
you,
that?
Sam, would you repeat this again?
The property has to be in a broom
Collier-
clean
No,
condition.
no,
and
no,
free of debris.
no, the title, and Collier,
In Collier County, the contract says that the buyer pays for title. In Lee and Charlotte County, the seller pays for title.
that's
But,
correct.
but in Lee and Charlotte County, under the Nabor contract, the buyer picks the title company, even though they don't pay for it. So if you have buyers and you're in Lee or Charlotte County and you want to control the title company, then you would use the Nabor form over the FAR/BAR form.
Hmm.
So that's a strategic thought process you have to go in there. Okay. Financing under the Nabor contract. Very, very different from FAR/BAR. With a cash box checked, you can still get the financing, still get a loan, but you cannot have the CFPB protections. What does that mean? That means that if your lender misses the closing date and you won't have 10 days to correct any document errors or other issues that you would normally get if you had checked the financing box. So be very careful there. I strongly recommend that you only check the cash box if your buyer has the cash, even if they choose to get financing, because you don't want to lose the deposit if you miss the closing date. There's no default rate for financing. I would not put prevailing or MRK for market or things like that. I would talk to your lender and put an interest rate in the blank. This is on line 61. Be very careful there about not, if you miss filling out terms, you run the risk. There's a very bad case called the Lafont case that says if you don't apply for the loan that you wrote on the contract, you won't have certain protections in the FAR/BAR contract. And it's an open question how much of that applies to the Nabor contract, because it also has language about being diligent in your efforts and having good faith in your efforts to get your loan approved. If you have FHA or VA financing, You check that box in the financing section of the contract here on page 2, and then you have to attach the VA FHA addendum. Now, sellers don't like this addendum because they think it means that the buyer can get out if the property doesn't appraise, and they're correct. So be very careful there. I mean, it's very popular financing, but the seller just needs to understand that that's going to be a possibility. Now, in the Nabor contract, the buyer must affirmatively waive the contingency in writing. It's not like the FAR bar where the contingency just terminates and the deposit goes hard. At the end of the contingency period in the Nabor contract, either the buyer or seller may terminate the contract and the deposit goes back to the buyer, as long as the buyer, when they terminate, have a denial letter or evidence from their lender of a good faith effort to apply. Isabella, you're asking if the buyer is getting a loan and check the box for cash financing without contingency, where do I enter the mortgage amount? Isabella, you don't enter the mortgage amount. If you had a financing contingency, you would enter that on page 1 under line 34. But if you have a cash offer, you wouldn't put a mortgage amount on the contract. Okay. And for those of you that may have joined late, the chat is open and I'm responding to questions in the chat as they come up as well. So you can unmute yourself or you can enter any question into the chat. Okay, so assuming there was a finance contingency, there's a 10-day window for closing for CFPB compliance only. What does that mean? If the borrower didn't get all their documents to the lender on time, that's not CFPB document compliance issues. That is slow buyer is going to lose their deposit. So it's the contingency for financing is solely because of lender delay in getting the CD out and getting the documents executed and sent back. So be very careful there. You don't want a situation where your buyer is behind and they're not approved and they're trying to get out of the contract after the finance contingency is over. That's not how it works. Okay. One last thing on this before I move on. You only get the 10-day window once the contingency is waived. So there's a strategy in there. Do I waive it? Am I close to being approved? You have to think through this and talk to your lender and talk to your closing agent and see what the status is before you waive the finance contingency, and know that if you waive the finance contingency, that's when you get your 10 days. Okay. So the next part of the contract talks about association and government liens and special assessments. The seller pays everything that's assessed before the effective date. The buyer pays after the effective date. And there's a 3-part test in the contract to determine if the assessment is already set in stone. You need certainty as to the identity of the liener. That's the person, that's the association. You need certainty as to the property being assessed. That's the unit. And then you need to know the amount of the lien assessed against the specific unit. If you have all 3, then the seller pays. If you don't, then the buyer pays. Now, this is very confusing here. What does pending mean? So in section 6 of the contract, there's the second sentence says, if, as of the effective date, there are any pending liens or special assessments which are not seller's obligation and which were not disclosed in writing to the buyer by seller prior to or concurrent with the execution of the contract, and which exceed 1% of the purchase price, buyer may terminate unless seller agrees to pay. What does all that mean? Well, there's a question about if the assessment is pending, which means that it's been discussed at the board, there maybe has been a vote of a preliminary approval of something by the board, it's in the minutes, it's on the agenda. What does pending mean? And the question comes up, if 2 guys are standing about the pool and talking about leaks or landscaping and they're talking about a special assessment to correct an error, it's probably not pending. But what if the two guys are the president and vice president of the association? You know, and then you just go down the line. What if they put it on a meeting agenda? What if it makes it into the meeting minutes? You know, what if there's a preliminary vote? When is the assessment pending? This is an open legal question, and you have to know your community. It's very important that you know your community and know what the status of any assessments are. Okay. Let's talk next. The next section is leases. If the property is subject to a lease, check the box in section 7. Buyer has 5 days to deliver the lease, and the seller has 5 days to review and terminate if they don't like the lease. Very simple. Okay, inspections. So we're going to talk in greater detail about standard D2 of inspections in a few minutes, but this is section 8 of the contract. And basically you get 3 choices. You get your full inspection provisions, which we're going to talk about later. Question? Okay. You're going to get your due diligence inspection, which is an as-is inspection, and you would attach the appropriate as-is addendum. Now, be very careful. There are 2 addendums that go along here. There's the as-is addendum, which basically converts the Nabor regular contract to an as-is contract. And then there's the free look contract, where the buyer gets all their inspections, and the seller has to review and go through the inspection process, but the buyer also gets a free look. So make sure you use the correct inspection addendum. And then of course, the third choice in section 8 is the waiver of inspections, where the buyer is not going to do anything. And that's a very specific situation, and I would be cautious about doing that. But in this market, I'm seeing it more and more. Okay. So let's talk now, go through the standards of the contract. Standard A is very important. It starts with, what do you get? Marketable title. Title that the buyer can resell in the future. It's not fee simple, it's not clear title, it's marketable title. It's something the buyer can resell. It's going to be subject to the association requirements. It's going to be subject to taxes by the government, utilities. So be very careful about what you're quote unquote selling. Make sure that you counsel your buyers they're getting marketable title. We have a question from Alejandra. So if you select cash, but they're actually financing, you notify by addendum at a later time. Yes, Alejandra, you can do that. Or you can just send an email to the listing agent, say, hey, my buyers are getting financing. We know it's a cash offer. Okay, sorry. Back to the slides. So again, I mentioned this before, Nabor contracts are freely assignable by the buyer. You have 15 days prior to closing. You get your buyer information to the closing agent, and you can use the assignment form to tell the other side who the new buyer is going to be. Next up, I see a lot of realtors will put 1031 language in the other terms and conditions section of the contract. In the Nabor and the FAR actually, you don't need to do that because it's already in there under standard A. Says that everybody agrees to cooperate in the event of a 1031 exchange. Standard B talks about title. And what it says is in the contract says that the seller has 10 days to deliver their prior policy to the buyer's agent, the closing agent, or give the buyer $150 credit. This drives people crazy. I see it scratched out a lot. Of course, as a realtor, you should not be modifying the pre-printed terms and conditions, and we say in bold, don't modify the terms and conditions. But sellers generally don't like this provision and will cross it out if they're made aware of it. The contract gives the buyer 30 days to examine title and determine if there's an issue, and notify the seller of any title issues. And the seller then has 30 days to clear title. And this is a provision that may extend the closing date. If the seller gets title 5 days before closing and they got to do a probate, there's a clearance period that you're going to have to go through. If the seller cannot clear title, buyer has 5 days to terminate or accept the title as is at the end of the clearance period. Now this is a big deal. In the Nabor contract, the seller may have to spend money and bring lawsuits to clear title, and that's required by contract. So you've got to be, if you've got the seller, they need to know if there's things out there that they probably know about, judgments or liens. Those are all going to be paid off at closing unless they come up with a reduced payoff or it's not their lien. We do same name affidavits quite a bit when people have similar names. Okay, before I move on to standard C, does anybody have any questions about A or B or anything we've covered so far? Okay. Standard C talks a little bit about the surveys and coastal construction. Basically, the seller has 10 days to deliver their survey. The buyer may get a survey up to 5 days prior to closing, and any survey objections are treated as title objections. So again, if you are getting a loan and you don't want to get a survey until you get your loan approved, you have 5 days prior to closing to turn the survey over to the seller with the title objections, maybe a 30-day extension on your contract. So you've got to be very careful there. Now surveys, I'll tell you right now, are running 4 and 5 weeks behind. So
Wow.
yeah, it's pretty crazy, 4 and 5 weeks behind. So make sure that you get your survey ordered right away. Especially on these 30-day closes. Anna, did you have a question?
No, I just said, wow.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, let's talk about standard D1, the disclosures. This is where we start getting into some of the very difficult issues in the Nabor contract about disclosure, permitting, and inspections. So Johnson v. Davis is a court case that says that sellers have to make buyers aware of known latent defects that materially affect the value of the property. Future case law since then, which came out in the 80s, says that realtors have the same obligation. So if your buyer tells you, your seller tells you, hey, I had a mold problem, don't worry, I bleached it and I painted over it, that's a problem. You are going to have to disclose that to the buyer, whether the seller tells you to or not. So be very careful there. Next, the other disclosures, the contract says there are no open permits or improvements done without permits. If your seller knows of open permits or improvements done without permits, they're going to be immediately in breach of contract if they sign this with that knowledge, and they should pre-disclose those on a seller's disclosure, and that seller's disclosure should be signed by the buyer prior to entering the contract. Lori is asking website to check for open permits. Lori, if you go to the Collier County Growth Management Office website, Code Enforcement Office website, you can get to the websites for open permits. There are 2 of them. I can also send you a link later if you send me an email. So if anybody needs to know the permit search websites, I can send you a link to both of those after the presentation. Just shoot me an email. And then this contract also says, and this comes up quite a bit, that buyers are responsible to do their own investigation into the club and association rules and requirements. It's not up to the seller to tell you that the club dues are mandatory and that they're $50,000 a year. You've got to look in and know your communities and know your associations. Okay, Joey is asking, where is the CDD MSTU for Collier? That's on the tax bill, Joey. You look those up on the tax bill. Okay. Standard D2, famous Nabor inspection provision. I see some folks that I've talked to quite a bit about this on there, Mike. Let's see, hold on. Before I get into the D2, let's talk about Paula is asking what happens when there's an improvement without a permit. It has to be disclosed, Paula, and you're probably going to have to get it permitted. That means it may need an engineer. It may need an inspection from the county, may need to get the contractor that did the work involved. So there's a lot that can go into that if you've made improvements without proper permits. And then Kristen's asking, is there a 3-day rescission period to review all docs if you're purchasing a single family home and HOA like there is for a condo? Chris, that's a great question. I'm going to answer it very briefly now because we're going to talk about it further later. But essentially, it depends when the the HOA disclosure was given. When the HOA disclosure was given. And then Paul, again, your question about surveys, if it takes over 30 days to get a survey, how do we get them in 10 days? You have to order them early. You're not going to get them in 10 days. And then Lori is asking, must repairs be completed by a licensed contractor to code? Yes, and yes, Lori, they must be completed by a licensed contractor and to code. Okay, so inspections. So I want everyone here to remember the numbers 15, 5, 10, and 5. In the Nabor contract, you have 15 days. By default, you can shorten it. There's a blank there now in this new form. That's another big change from a previous form. You can shorten the inspection period in the Nabor contract or lengthen it. But you have 15 days by default to get your inspections done. You have 5 days to gather the reports and deliver them to the seller with your inspection election form and your list of inspection items. There are 2 forms that the Nabor form set that are required to get your inspection election. That's the inspection election and buyers and sellers response form and the list of defective items form. Those are 2 forms from your forms folders you're going to look at and understand very carefully. Then the seller has 10 days to respond to the buyer's election. And then if the seller rejects or counters the buyer's election, then the buyer has 5 days to terminate. There are 6 items that you can look for that you can have inspected. There's your systems and equipment, which is your plumbing, your air conditioning, your electrical, your panel, your radon, lead-based paint, WDO, mold, and open permits. If any of these things come back with a contractually defined defective issue, then the buyer may request a credit or remedial action. The credit has to equal the cost of remedial action. That's a big one. It's not how, if you have a broken washer, the buyer doesn't get a new washer. The buyer gets a working condition washer at closing. Now this, you get into the question of, well, 2 different repair people have said this washing machine is not repairable at all. Then maybe the better thing to do for the buyer is to ask for a credit so they can get a new washer. If they want to demand a new washer or a working washer, then the contract is not clear as to what the buyer is entitled to, and you're going to run into an issue. Robert is asking, please identify line numbers for the 15, 5, 10, and 5. Robert, that's going to take me a little longer than I've got. I can tell you that the 15 is on line 229. The 10 is on line 286. And the next 5 is on 286, line 289. Okay. Paul, how is it possible with the backlog of work? It's hard to get things done in time. Paul, it is hard. Sellers want to sell now and they don't want inspections. They don't want to deal with anything. Buyers want inspections. They want surveys. They're getting loans and they need time to get those things done. And everybody's backed up. Lenders are backed up. Surveyors are backed up. Inspectors are backed up. And you basically have to negotiate it out. And you got to put in an offer that makes sense for your buyer and with their needs and their timeline. And if it doesn't get accepted, you know, that's unfortunate. But if the buyer wants to be aggressive, they're going to miss out on some of their inspection issues. And I'm seeing a lot of that right now.
I have a question.
Yes,
On
Anna.
the inspections, you said there's 15 days by default. So basically they have before, obviously, the 15 days, the buyer to terminate the contract?
No, this contract is very hard to get out of for the buyer and the seller. And there is no termination right until you've gone all the way through the inspection process, which means the buyer gets inspections, they make elections, seller has to counter or reject. If the seller accepts the buyer's election, then you go to closing in this contract. It's not one where you can walk away from. It's not an as is.
Oh,
Sam? Oh. Sam,
Yes,
can you hear
yes,
me?
Paula. Yep.
I'm sorry, I got booted out. I had a question about, well, there's such a backlog and you know, my husband's a builder and he's like so busy. So like how do you get like these 10 days, 5 days? It's like, it seems impossible right now
Sure.
to get all of that done.
You have to negotiate. I think you got logged out right as I was answering your chat.
I know.
You have to negotiate it. And if you've got a long hold on your inspections, you're going to have to negotiate a longer inspection period or accept lesser inspections or no inspections. That's all there is to it.
It just feels like right now that's the only thing because people
Yep.
can't get to anything. So do you have to do an addendum or something to the contract?
No, on line 229, you put the amount of time that you need for inspections. And if it's longer than
Okay.
15, it may be longer than 15, and you have to talk to your seller, your listing agent, try and get that accepted.
Okay, I got it. Okay, thank
Sure.
you.
You got it. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about working condition versus cosmetic condition. This contract has a very detailed list starting on line 294 through line 305 that talks about working condition versus cosmetic condition. If things are in working condition, then the seller doesn't have to repair them. Again, you don't get the new washer and dryer, you don't get the new fridge, you get what's there on the date the contract is signed, the effective date. And if it's not in working condition, which is designed as the designer intended for it to operate, then you can't ask for it to be repaired. And if you do, you run the risk of having a breach of contract. If it's a cosmetic condition, torn screens, worn shingles, chips, pits, cracks that are small in windows, again, cosmetic conditions, and you can't ask for it. I get a lot of questions about, well, you know, what's a good one? You know, there's a crack in the seawall. Well, did you have it inspected by an engineer? Is it structurally sound? If it's structurally sound, then it's in working condition. Same thing with roofs. If they're structurally sound and watertight, even though there are missing shingles or cracked tiles, it's in working condition if it's watertight and structurally sound. So in the event that you do have maintenance items that need to be repaired and the seller agrees to maintain them and the seller doesn't get them done in time for closing, then you have a 200% escrow. This is another difference from the FAR contract where the buyer only gets 125% escrow. We do 200% in the Nabor contract, and it again is an estimate of what it's going to take to complete the repairs. So when you're doing your walkthrough, which can be an arduous process because you're only allowed to look for 4 things in this contract. You can't bring your designers and your contractors to your walkthrough. When you're doing your walkthrough, if you notice items that were supposed to be repaired are not repaired, you have to get an estimate. You have to get somebody in there quickly, so be prepared for that. So if you have the buyer, have a good handyman available to come and give you estimates. Okay. We're going to move pretty quickly through some of these because we're falling behind on the schedule. Standard D2E talks about risk of loss. Risk of loss includes the landscaping in the Nabor contract. And then it also talks about insurance. If the buyer may delay closing for up to 30 days if insurance is unavailable. The contract may be terminated if the property is rendered uninhabitable or uninsurable. That's an issue. That came up after Irma quite a bit. And then, of course, we talk about seller's risk of loss includes the landscaping, but there's a limitation to 1% of the purchase price. So if you've got a $300,000 closing, you're going to only have to replace landscaping up to 3%, up to $3,000, which actually is a very low number if they lost a royal palm or or a large coconut tree. So that's a very good limitation for sellers in this contract. And then, of course, if there is a hurricane, the buyer gets one more limited inspection to determine damages. Okay. We got a couple of questions. Michael O'Rourke says, is the inspection notice included all inspection reports, or can each report be delivered to the seller individually over the 20 days? This contract now says, Mike, that you get one bite at the inspection apple. So I would deliver all reports together with the inspection election. I certainly, if reports were coming in slowly and you wanted to get them to the seller so they could start looking at them, give them all the reports as they come in is fine, but don't deliver your inspection election until after your last inspection is complete and you have that report, because you only get one inspection election. Lori is asking time frame for arbitration mediation after settlement. Lori, there is no mediation in the Nabor contract. You just sue each other. So if the contract goes to closing and there's a problem, you have a 4-year statute of limitations. Isabel is asking, do buyers have to close when the condition was not remediated no matter what? The only way is the escrow hold. Yes, Isabel, in the Nabor contract, as with the Farbar contract, actually, you go to closing when there are inspection items and you do an escrow. Okay. Other questions about inspections? I know it's a lot, it's like 4 pages of the contract, it's a big deal, standard D. Anything else that have questions about that? Okay, seeing none. Standard E and F, instruments and expenses. So again, the buyer picks the title company in all counties. In Lee County, the seller pays for title insurance. The seller pays for the doc stamps on the deed. The buyer pays for doc stamps and intangibles tax on the note and mortgage. And then a difference from the Farbar, the buyer pays for the lien search in the Nabor contract. Prorations and credits. Of course, this is more for the title company to deal with. But we prorate the taxes and the association dues. When we're dealing with new construction, which I'm seeing a lot of new construction, you prorate 80% of the value of the structure or of the property, and we calculate the taxes based on what it's going to be. I always say, people, don't forget to check for propane. It's in the contract. We prorate the propane, and then of course rents are prorated and security deposits are transferred. All right, so let's talk about HOAs and condos for a moment. HOA have a right to void the contract for up to 3 days after the HOA disclosure is received by the buyer. So the buyer gets the disclosure, they have 3 days to review it and terminate the contract. Now, the HOA disclosure right to terminate terminates if the HOA disclosure was delivered before the contract was signed. Condos get a 3-day right no matter what. And don't forget the governance form. It's in the contract. It's available in your standard form libraries. Don't forget the condo governance form. Any questions about the HOA disclosure? Let's get these questions. Any questions about the HOA or condo disclosure? Remember, condos, you deliver documents. HOAs, you deliver the disclosure.
Sam, what is,
Yes, Kristen.
what, sorry, regarding that, so is provided, so does that say if the listing agent uploaded it to the MLS that is provided, so prior to contract? Or
you still need the buyer to sign it.
Okay,
Buyer, just because it's in the MLS doesn't make it delivered. Buyer needs to sign off on the HOA disclosure, and they need to sign off on the condo doc receipt.
So how does the 3 days start then if they're signing it once they have an executed contract?
It's 3 days from the date the buyer signs. So if you, for example, you have you're selling in Treviso Bay or Ronawalk, wherever you are. And the HOA disclosure is uploaded to the MLS. You put in the confidential remarks, something along the lines of offers should include a signed HOA disclosure. And then when you get your offer in, if the HOA disclosure is already signed and delivered, then when the seller goes to accept the offer, there's no 3-day right in the HOA. Now, this is different from condos because condos, you deliver the documents and then you still have 3 days to void them if you deliver them before contracting. Lisa is asking, is the condo governance form and form simplicity? Yes, it is, Lisa. Kristen, did I answer your question?
Yeah, so let me just verify. So if you have an executed contract, the next day you deliver as the buyer's agent, the next day you deliver the signed HOA disclosure. You have 3 days from delivering that signed HOA disclosure?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Very welcome. Dawn is asking, what's the difference between the condo rider and the HOA rider? Dawn, in the Nabor contract, we don't have riders for the HOA and the condo. Those issues are addressed in the standard form. In the FARBAR contract, you have to attach the rider and fill it out for the appropriate association. And you would not use both forms because the condo statute says that if you've got a condo in an HOA, you don't have to make the HOA disclosures because you've made the condo disclosures. So you would not really ever use both of them.
Sam, I have one more question regarding the HOA. So what form, if you're going to terminate the contract with the 3 days, what form do you use?
Nabor provides an HOA condo termination form.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, it's one of the forms in your folder.
Can you briefly explain what the condo governance form is?
Kay, it is I've actually never really read through it all the way because this is one of those forms that the state puts out that people insist on getting, but it really just says that you notify that your condominium is being governed by an association and you have certain rights. It's a pretty basic government form that you're required to provide by contract.
Thank you.
Lori is asking, coming soon, time frame permissible for advertising. Laura, I think you're talking about the new NAR rules for posting to the MLS, and I'm gonna say that's probably outside the scope of this presentation. Angela, so if there's a condo within an HOA, the HOA disclosure is not required, only the condo docs delivered and condo receipt signed. Angela, that's correct. That's what the statute says. Okay. Standard J, condo homeowner association provisions. So the buyer has 10 days to make application to the association. And if there's no approval, then the buyer or seller can terminate on the closing date. The seller is responsible to get the association estoppels and deliver them to the closing agent 15 days prior to closing. Of course, by custom, we all, closing agents, we all order the estoppels for the seller, so you don't have to do that. Now, this is a new one, ground leases. There's several ground leases in Naples that are less than 40 years left in them. If there are less than 40 years, then the buyer may terminate. And if you are buying a co-op, there's a separate co-op addendum that has the same language about the ground leases. Most co-ops are on a lease. Okay, standard K, if the buyer gets financing, the lender controls. This is the golden rule, I call it. He who has the gold makes the rules. If the lender has procedures for closing, the title company has to follow them, and the buyer and seller agree to allow that to happen. Standard L, the escrow agent is not liable for hardly anything. If the deal falls apart, then the buyer, then the escrow agent may sue to determine who's responsible or who gets the deposit back. It's called an interpleader lawsuit. It's expensive and a waste of time. So I highly recommend that we settle our deposit disputes outside of the court system. Okay, standard M, FIRPTA. This is a buyer obligation. People get confused about FIRPTA thinking because the seller has to put 15% down. It's actually the buyer's responsibility to see that that happens. You have the contract gives the title company 10 days to remit the 15% withholding to the IRS unless there's an exemption. Remember, the exemption is under 300,000, there's 0 withholding, and under $1 million, there's a 10% withholding. But there's another part of that test. The buyer has to use the property as their primary, has to be the person who used the property the most of anybody who uses the property in the next 2 years. I teach a whole class on FIRPTA, so we can talk about that in that class. But the seller holds the buyer harmless for the FIRPTA amount, so the ultimate liability always falls on the seller. If there's a quick closing, we call it the hurry up provision in standard N. We compress all the deadlines that I just talked about, the 15, 5, 10, 5, the survey deadline, everything gets compressed and must be done by the closing date, except the condo and HOA void periods, which are statutorily prescribed. Okay, defaults and remedies. If the buyer does not perform under the contract, the buyer loses the deposit, and that is the seller's sole remedy. What does that mean? That means you can't sue for damages or specific performance. You just get the deposit if you're the seller. And that's why I said at the beginning of the presentation that it's best to have better deposits. Let's see, here we have a question. Lisa is asking, this is assuming the buyer resides outside the US, correct? If the seller resides outside the US, then the seller is responsible for getting the FIRPTA addendum. No, Lisa, the buyer is always responsible for the FIRPTA withholding and for filling out the paperwork. If the seller wants to reduce the withholding, then the seller can do some paperwork as well. The being inside or outside of the US is not relevant. It's the citizenship status of the seller that matters. Okay, if the seller does not perform, the seller doesn't deliver title, then the buyer can sue for specific performance or damages or terminate the contract and get their deposit back. Specific performance means the buyer takes the property from the seller, and it's very, very expensive, and the seller will lose a lot of money. So I always recommend we settle those issues as soon as possible. In the event of litigation, the attorney's fees of the loser of the winner are paid by the loser, and where is it here? The prevailing party gets their commissions. Let's see, I remember I said this correctly. The prevailing party includes the buyer, the seller, and any broker acting in an agency relationship, so that you get your attorney's fees paid as well. I apologize for hurrying, but we have 1 minute left, and I still want to take your questions. So under standard Q, this is kind of the basic notices, disclosures, and acknowledgements. Everything has to be in writing. And you cannot deliver I should have said this earlier, you cannot deliver the association documents to the agent. As the realtor, you have to get these to the buyer to get the 3-day clock ticking. So don't sit on them. That's been an issue. Okay. Again, all modifications to the contract have to be in writing. The deadline in the Nabor contract is 11:59 p.m. When you have a weekend or a holiday, or you extend to the next business day, there is no 5 p.m. deadline like the FARBAR contract. Nabor goes to 11:59 in all cases. The contract also says the deposit goes back to the buyer unless otherwise stated in the contract. And the settlement statement may be delivered to everybody, including the realtors. Then the standard S talks about negotiated terms and representations. Note here that you have some protections. The buyer holds the broker harmless for failing cause if the seller failures to disclose, and then the broker cannot be held responsible for performance. And then, of course, standard T is an admonishment to get your own attorneys and your own talk to your own accountants. It's in bold and or sorry, it's in all caps, and it's one of those provisions that are included that you should know about and that you should be very careful about, so that you are not giving legal advice. Direct people to their attorneys, their CPAs, their stockbrokers. Don't give out legal advice, and this protects you if you don't. Okay, so in the other terms and conditions and the addenda portion on the last page, so it can be unlicensed practice of law for a realtor to write things into the contract and other terms and conditions. So check with your favorite closing attorney whenever you do that, and be very careful what your broker's rules are. Another thing is Nabor provides 80 forms. There's not going to be a lot of instances where you have to write in special terms and conditions. It's probably in the forms. So be very careful about that. And then, of course, the last part of the contract, the wire fraud advisory, do not share wire instructions. I know that you're tempted, you're trying to get the deposit in, it's a short deadline and you want to get it done, you want to be helpful, but don't share the wire instructions. Let the title company give the buyer and the seller them directly. Paula, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I missed that first part. I've been stuck on this. It says like with the purchase price, you put the purchase price, that's your offer, then you put the 5 to 10% initial deposit. When it says additional deposit, the effective date, what are the days? And then the
I would put
proceeds.
3 days for the initial deposit. That's pretty typical, is 3 to 4 days. And then 15 to 20 days for the second deposit.
Okay, and then what about the other stuff after that, proceeds of mortgage?
Well, if you're getting a loan, if the buyer's getting a mortgage, you would put the amount of the mortgage there, and then the last line you would put the amount that you used to put the amount that's left that the buyer brings to closing.
I don't understand that. I'm sorry. You said, is that E, the balance of the purchase price?
Yes.
So is that minus the fees of your commission and all of that stuff? I don't think I follow that.
That comes off separately on the seller side. I'll tell you what, Paula, what we'll do is,
Okay.
because we are running out of time, I will give you a call and I'll walk you through it.
Okay, I'm sorry. I missed that
No
first
problem.
part when I logged in.
You got it. Okay. With that, does anybody have any other questions? Shout them out or put them in the chat.
Is it possible to send us the slides?
Absolutely, Mona. I'm going to put my email in the chat.
Thank you.
Send me an email and I will send you slides. I'm working on a way to get them out prior to in the distribution. Other questions? Line 123, Jason is asking about. Yes, Jason, let me get to line 123. Now, Jason, my 123 talks about the $150 credit. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the seller should have a title insurance policy from when they purchased. If they have it, they should deliver it to the buyer's closing agent within 10 days of contracting. If they don't have it or they don't deliver it, then there's a $150 credit from the seller to the buyer for the title insurance.
Okay, thank you. That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify that I was understanding that
You
correctly.
got it. Lisa is asking, is there a form for an escalation clause? Lisa, I can provide you some escalation clause language. Nabor has debated but not yet produced an escalation clause form. So just send me an email offline and I will do that. Some of you are putting your email in the chat. once I log out, I'm gonna lose your email. You gotta send me an email.
Oh,
Don't
okay,
don't put your email address in the chat.
okay. I have a question. I mean,
Understand
I'm a bit confused because, you know, the FAR bar is different, obviously. On that inspection, 15, 5, 10, 5,
that. Yep,
uh, you have 15 days by default.
Right.
Within those 15 days, you have 5 days to get the report, correct?
no, that's it. 5 days comes after the 15 days.
Oh, after.
Yeah.
Okay, so then,
The total inspection period time, if you used it all, is 35 days.
oh, okay, that's where I'm confused, because I thought it was, okay. Gotcha now, okay.
Yep.
Thank you,
You're
sorry.
very welcome. Okay, other questions? Valentina is asking for escalation. If you send me an email, because I'll lose the chat.
Okay,
I will help you with an escalation clause. It's usually deal specific though, so I don't have a general form.
so let me ask a question. What are the main differences from the Nabor to the FAR bar is the inspections and what else?
The biggest difference is the financing.
Okay.
Major financing differences. The FAR bar is much more harsh when it comes to financing. I will tell you that the Nabor contract is the superior document for a buyer in financing. The FAR bar as is probably better for a cash deal, although the Nabor as is and the FAR bar as is and cash are virtually identical. There are a few differences, but for financing a buyer's transaction, I would use the Nabor contract. For cash deal, I would use either one. As is, I would use either one. And then very few people use the FAR bar regular contract, which of course has the provisions for the seller to expend money, specific dollar amounts for repairs. I'll tell you this, another thing, since here in the last few minutes, each contract form is a tool, and you should know all of them. I teach the FAR bar contracts as well. There are tools. Different situations call for different tools. Sometimes you need a regular, sometimes you need a Phillips head screwdriver, and that's just the way it is. And you got to know all of them and be a resource for your customer so they keep coming back to you. They refer you business. And knowing your forms, I think, is probably the smartest way to get that done. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or go in the chat. Let's see, Debbie, if a seller agent requests a specific contract you have to use, Debbie, it's a good idea. It's not a law. If a seller knows the contract and wants a FAR bar as is contract, and you're a Nabor person, I would go with the FAR bar as is unless I had a really good reason like financing not to do it. Other questions, anybody? All righty. I'm going to call it a wrap then. We're about 9 minutes over past the deadline, but that's okay. I'm happy to answer questions offline.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
And I will talk to you all soon.